Back in, 2012, I finished my first book about a little company called Muslim. If you remember it, there was an attempt to start like a Facebook for Muslims, and it was based here in Finland. And it didn't work out. But when that book was published early in 2012, my publisher asked me if I wanted to do one on Nokia. And at that time, I turned them down because it didn't seem like there was an ending to the story yet. We still weren't sure what was going to happen with Nokia. So I turned them down and wrote the novel. And early in 2013, when that was completed, it was clear that the Nokia story was coming to an end, so I knew we needed to start quickly. So I went to the publisher and asked if they still wanted the Nokia book, and they said yes. So I had to hurry and start writing.
Mm-hmm. So what did you do? How did you execute the book? How did you do? Or how many interviews and how long did it take you to write it?
It took about a year, and this was working 70 hours a week.
Yeah. Plus writing a few columns for...
Yes, I was still writing journalism at the same time and promoting the novel, so it was a very hectic time. I probably had maybe 100 interviews around there. I was really afraid when I started that people wouldn't want to talk because it's such a touchy subject that so many former executives, they don't want to come out and talk about their experiences. But the problem I had was too many people wanted to talk. It wasn't not getting them, but the majority of them had to be anonymous because they went on to other careers and they don't want to come out publicly talking about their old company. But I had one very high-ranking executive as one of my very first interviews, and he was telling all of his old colleagues to talk to me. So that was a big help. Without him helping, I probably wouldn't have got many of the people I did.
Okay. Okay. And you interviewed people from the outside as well, customers and partners kind of thing?
Analysts, journalists, politicians, people from Nokia competitors, inside and outside.
Okay. So I think, I'd like to, at least myself, hit a couple different angles on this. One is kind of strategic issues, one maybe operational, and maybe another one cultural. And I think, as I have read the book, it's excellent. And I think one of your key points here is that it wasn't so much a strategic, or it wasn't a failure of foresight as much as it was a inability to kind of adapt. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Exactly. Nokia was not caught by surprise by the ecosystems, by touch screens, by third-party apps. They knew all of this. They were working on all of this stuff before, Android or Apple became involved in it. And a lot of this, they were the catalyst to get us going. But even though they could see where the industry was going, they weren't able to execute to properly take advantage of this. I think part of that was just down to the way they had multi-segmented their markets. They had this huge current business, and to look to where the industry was going, they would have had to take resources away from all their current product lines, their current operating system, and money today is worth more than money tomorrow, the time value of money. So it made sense, I guess, from their point of view, to try to exploit the current business instead of looking to where they knew it was going.
Okay, so it's really it's a classic innovator's dilemma issue where you can't cannibalize your own market because you're making so much money there. Okay. And how about the culture that kind of evolved like this? I think it's been fascinating. Nokia, I remember 10, 15 years ago, was the absolute poster child of agility and ability. If Nokia wanted to do it, they went out and did it. I think you're kind of saying that, again, they knew what they needed to do, but they couldn't get the rank and file to actually go where they were kind of needed to go, and then vice versa, the rank and file couldn't get the message up from the market. Am I saying that correctly?
Yes, it was. One of the interviewees talked about that. The organization became so thick that when orders came down from the top, it had to drip down layer after layer, and it got diluted as it came down. And of course, the the salesmen and the people in touch with the customers, when they saw things happening, the same thing had to happen. The message had to come back up to the top before decisions were made, and the message was diluted at the same time. One of my favorite stories is about the famous Nokia values. When they first formulated these values, the dream team, I think it was just 6 people, sat down around a table and came up with the famous Nokia values. And of course that changes over time. And
what were they?
I don't remember all of them, but one example I'm going to use is the customer satisfaction,
right,
which I think every company in the world who has defined values has satisfying the customer as number one.
Right.
Well, when the values were changed, 2008, 2009, I'd have to check exactly. Instead of just having a couple people formulate the values, they had something like 10,000 people. They had 16 different meetings, and the intranet was involved, so even people who didn't go to the meetings were able to participate in these formulating the values. And they had this idea that, well, who do we have to answer to as a company? Of course, you've got to the employees, you've got to the regulators, you've got the investors, you've got the public, and you've got, finally, the customers. So satisfying the customer morphed into engaging you, meaning they wanted to satisfy everyone, which, of course, that makes sense. You have to worry about your investors and employees. But just the idea that they changed satisfying the customer to engaging you, it seems like they were kind of losing focus on becoming more interested in their internal organization or the products than the customers.
Very interesting, very interesting. And that renewal that happened, I think, 2008, 2009, and already, I guess, obviously the iPhone and Android were already getting a lot of traction there, so it was a bit late. I'm going to ask, maybe this is my last question, and then ask you to start thinking about your own. I know there's people here that have some really deep insight. But into that kind of operating system question, what was your kind of finding in terms of how kind of it evolved to being, kind of putting all the eggs in the Windows Phone basket?
Well, at the time it made sense. I guess one problem was people are upset they didn't go to Android. And Android is a great system, but Nokia would have had to go head-to-head against Samsung. And Samsung controlled that market, and Samsung was lean, and they were mean, and they were fast. And Nokia competing against that would have been very tough. And that's I guess, a negative reason they didn't like Android. But I guess a more positive reason was they were still optimistic. They thought they could still get 40% market share again, like they had just in 2007 and in 2007. So that they had hoped that with Windows they would be able to have more control over the operating system and still have some control over their own destiny. Right. And if you lose control of the operating system, you lose control of much of the product. Right. So that made sense why they wanted to go to Windows. But they made it a long-term exclusive deal. So they removed the freedom of action. They had one chance. And if that didn't work, then this is what happens.
Okay. Good, and I think there's actually some I saw an article you wrote last week, I think at the end of the book. So I'll ask maybe later on about your view of the future, because I think it's quite positive. But can I ask for some comments or points? I know there are a number of people out here with Nokia backgrounds or interacting, and so I don't want to correct you. Have a
actually, if I can get away with two, I'll try to.
Please.
You mentioned a bit earlier on that basically the structure of Nokia became like so. There was such a hierarchy involved, which meant that like the orders had to go through multiple layers, and therefore they got diluted by the time they reached the actual execution. I mean, you could say the same of almost any big company, including Apple or Google, etc. Why didn't they have that specific problem? There was exactly the inverse. That's question number one. Question number two is. I mean, unfortunately I can't share the names because it's on an anonymous basis, but this is people who used to work at Nokia Research. Nokia had the touch screen, the iPhone style touch screen before anyone. And the project got killed by somebody who went on to be on the board of Nokia because it was at the time that they had the flap phone. And he didn't want to cannibalize the flap phone, where he thought that that's like actually the future. Nobody wants a big screen and a big phone. Everybody's going to go after the smaller phones and the flap phones. So to me, that's a major strategic failure, not just.
Yeah.
Well, when it comes to the organization, I think the matrix structure had, many big companies have the matrix organizational structure. But Nokia, they seem to be so inward looking. So when they were caught in this grid with their supervisors, and they were so inward looking, and they were unable to, I guess, see the big picture. They had the particular resources, the particular projects they're working on at any particular point in time, and they were not able to execute because so much energy was expended in these internal meetings, the strategic meetings, the bureaucracies, the PowerPoints. The example I use in the book was like a former Olympic champion who became fat, and all of a sudden all this energy has to be used just to walk around and stay alive instead of, you know, running and doing the high jump. And I think that was one of the main reasons why they couldn't execute. When it came to the touchscreen, yeah, there were so many stories like that. I talked to many researchers, people at NRC, and they all had all these anecdotes of these great things that were coming out but were killed somewhere. And I can see Nokia's problem, the decision maker's problem, because they were looking at this ultra-segmented market they had, and if someone came out with something, where would that fit into our product portfolio? And so they had the touch screens, but they kind of, okay, that's this segment. They didn't really understand, well, I guess they did understand how important it was going to be, but they weren't willing to sacrifice other portions, these other product lines, to focus on something like the capacitive touch screens.
And maybe another element that I think you bring out in the book is the overall leadership of the company. And I think if you look at Google, you've got Eric Schmidt. You've got Apple. You've got Steve Jobs. You know, inspirational leaders. And as I understood, you analyzed fairly in detail the selection of OPK, and maybe he had a different skill set than. Maybe being so inspirational. Was that a...
He's a very smart guy. OPK is a very smart guy. I guess if you look at his background, it kind of makes sense. Of course, he was trained as a lawyer, then went into finance, CFO. He wasn't quite as aggressive as he should have been. And another problem is he just was not inspirational, like Jorma Ollila. I mean, Ollila could get people to... if he was in this room, he could get us all to stand on their hands if he wanted us to. And OPK wasn't as inspiring as that. And I talked to one very major executive about the lack of visionary leaders, and I said, what about Anssi Vanjoki? And everyone always speaks so highly of him. And the executive said, of course, Vanjoki, he was inspirational, he had the vision, but he wasn't the #1 guy. So, you know, it all came down to OPK.
Interesting. Yeah.
What's your take on software capabilities and culture around creative software at Nokia? Because that's one of the reasons that Mr. Ollila gave as a source of Nokia's collapse in mobile space in his memory.
Yes, that's, you know, Nokia was known as a hardware company. They always have been. They've always had the best hardware too. And I think if they have a weakness, it was in software. One major executive I talked to, he said in hindsight, he wished they had moved their entire software operation to Silicon Valley and did everything there, because they could have brought in those competencies, you know, from the Bay Area. And he does have a point. I mean, the North American market wasn't that important when to Nokia, because they were selling so many and much product in India or China or South America. So in the balance sheet or on the income statement, North America wasn't that important, but there were so many other changes happening there, especially with ecosystems, third-party apps, software. So in hindsight, that was a major error, not paying more attention to North America, not just as a sales opportunity, but as a base for some of their operations.
Very interesting.
Was there any kind of discussion about the you know, that just abandon the U.S.? the people you interviewed?
I've never heard of any attempts to abandon it. I know one of, like the head of the N95, when it came out, Jonas Guest, he was telling me that he can't count how many meetings where the U.S. was at the top of the agenda.
Yeah.
So they knew how important it was, but they saw how important it was, but were not able to execute.
Yeah.
And OPK famously, he'd said that he wouldn't sleep until they had cracked North America again.
Yeah.
And that came back to haunt him because everyone kept remembering
I have
that.
to sleep once in a while.
Yeah, and he appeared to have been sleeping at some, but some other, yeah, demo.
Did the issue of mime or ego, did it come up? Because I think it was actually before Android existing Linux-based operating system. Okay, of course there was a Nokia some much bigger Symbian going on at the same time, but how come it didn't take off?
Well, they say that from a very early time they wanted to go open source in some fashion. Right. This was even back, maybe even before 2000. Yeah. They were thinking of open source. Yeah. But again, Symbian was making, or the products using Symbian was making so much money. It was hard to. It was hard to move resources away from that when it was doing so well. And so the Mamo people, they didn't have the time or the resources to work on the product. And Nokia kept flirting with Microsoft. And at one point in time, they even considered a joint project of some sort. But they couldn't. This was much before the decision to move to Windows. But when that fell apart and they knew Android was coming, that's when they started putting more resources and turned into what became MeeGo. But by then they had lost all the thunder. They didn't have the support of other people in the ecosystem because everyone was interested in Google's project by that point. So they had lost, all the wind had fallen from their sails.
One more.
Yeah, please.
I'm trying to synthesize a bit like what you're saying. Seems to me that what you're saying is like they got to a certain position where they were making money. They have a product that works, and they said we're not going to move from a product that works. That's essentially what's going down. We've got a Symbian system which is working very well. We see the value in the others, but we just don't want to do them because this is working so well now. Do you see any other companies, like for instance, it's not exactly in the same position, but I see like some things that resemble like people like Microsoft, for instance. They've got their Windows system, it's working. All they're doing is updating Windows. They've stopped really doing anything which is, as opposed to people like Apple or Google, who are like always searching for the next best thing. Do you see any similarities between, for instance, these two companies, or some other company that also?
Yes, I think that's a very, very popular comparison a lot of people are making. It's interesting because in the early 2000s, when there was a recession and the mobile device market ceased to grow, and Nokia came up with the idea of ultra-segmenting. They would stretch out the market to the very low end, have very cheap phones, and they basically created smartphones at that point in time. And so they ultra-segmented the market, and that worked beautifully. It really did. And of course, then everyone else was stagnant, but Nokia's sales keep growing and growing. The market share kept growing and growing. But then when the disruption came in 2007, 2008, when the iOS and Android came, they stuck to that, and they didn't change. And that was a major error, I think, on their part.
Yeah, thank you.
I haven't read your book, but what do you see was the impact of sticking to Symbian so long?
Well, yes, they knew very well the limitations of Symbian, but they were not able to have a replacement ready in time. Especially in the maybe 2006 onwards, everything was delayed constantly. They never could hit their own goals. Like the N97, they knew the N97 wasn't ready, but they had to have a replacement, so it came out. And with Symbian, they knew they had to have a replacement, but they could not get it ready. And it was just, again, down to they had the foresight of what was happening, but they were not able to execute. You know, that they couldn't get it done.
What do you consider to be the biggest biggest kind of hindrance in Symbian to kind of the kind of leading operating system still today?
Well, I don't have a deep technical understanding of Symbian. More of a general overview, but if I had to point to one thing that was the biggest problem, well, it's simply OPK. He needed to kick them and get them to work. And he could see what was happening. He saw the complacency. We have to give him credit for that. But he was not able to get them to move to where they needed to be. So he saw what was happening, but he couldn't execute either.
It seems to me, I mean, it seems, I remember in the early 2000s going around, we were, you know, I was with the Finnish venture capitalists at that point. We had a number of mobile companies, and we were laughing at the U.S. saying that, you know, we know mobile, they don't. And always the debate back then, which I think is simplistic, but I think it's true, is the internet world going to take over, or is the mobile world going to take over? And of course, Nokia was banking on the Nokia, the mobile world that is less dependent on visual presentation. And to me, at least, it's very simple. I mean, once there was a touch screen out there, Symbian just didn't drive that screen as well. It was set up to drive QWERTY keyboards plus some basic visuals. So I think once that new device came that was so beautiful, you know, the Symbian's days were numbered, and then all the guys who had been working with more resources, you know, paying much more attention to the visual presentation layer, they kind of went out. That was at least my own perspective, but I always laughed at that because, I mean, literally, we were marching around Silicon Valley telling the, you know, Americans they don't know, you know, Apple and, you know, new companies coming out of there, you don't know mobile, you need to come here. And in fact, obviously, we were dead wrong. I think, yeah, Klaus said it.
Yeah, a little bit. Thanks. Klaus from Finnish Business Angels Network. So thanks for the Nokia decline. We have a lot of private investors and a lot of startups here today. So that's a positive thing. But just yesterday, I talked with a person who worked at the Nokia Ventures, and she said that she experienced that the problem for Nokia, okay, they produced a lot of own R&D, but the ventures, they were only focused on mobile, and they weren't able to spread out their view, and they thought that was, of course, they're the best. And then the Nokia Ventures and the Blue Ventures, they were totally different. They didn't cooperate in any way either. So two questions. Do you agree that this is a little bit for Will as well, but do you agree that Nokia wasn't able to think outside of mobile? And the second one, because the person yesterday, she said that that's a risk for today as well for the corporations, that you have your main focus area, but then suddenly, boom, the internet side comes and takes over the phone. So is there any guides from the experience from Nokia?
Yeah, I agree exactly what she said. Ventures was, you know, an attempt for them to stay more agile and see changes happening, but they never went through with it. I have several examples in the book where ventures were interested in something, but the overall organization wouldn't go forward with it. And eventually, of course, you know, they just canceled the whole thing. So yes, I definitely agree that was a good attempt, but they didn't follow through with it.
I remember there's one great case. There was a Finnish kind of pretty heavy IP-based company on mobile video called Opleo. And I remember that Nokia, it was either Nokia Ventures or Blue Run Ventures, both venture arms of Nokia, one of them made an investment of several million euros in Opleo. And I know the team, and actually the CEO is now working at Nokia, or was not working at Nokia, and now is at PayPal. But when the investment came in, the team believed that they were going to be the video codec for Nokia. And then I think it was weeks, if not a couple months later, they announced an exclusive deal with Real Networks, which became the video codec. So the investment arm did something, and they're supposed to be independent, But they, of course, are trying to bring synergies to Nokia. But in fact, that company more or less died, or it's a stack of intellectual property right now. But the whole company was built up to be key to Nokia, and it never happened. And I think that was from the startup ecosystem here in Finland was often the case. It's really interesting in a paradox in a way, because I think all of us wanted to support Nokia. I was at a company called Valimo at the time, and we were built up to, we were really spending a lot of time working with them on their mobile identity solutions, and literally thousands of man hours of time spent in meetings, and we never actually got any commercial value. We got a lot more commercial value out of Ericsson than we got Nokia. And actually, our rationale for spending all that time with Nokia at the time was that we could act better with their biggest competitor, which was Ericsson, which is another, I think, a really interesting paradox here, because I think the Nokia guys were learning, and I think they believed that they were applying that, but I felt that we were getting actually more value out of them to bring value to their competitors. But I think this was, it happened over and over again. People, I think good people, intelligent people, that were not really able to champion the kind of external partners through the network. And I think that now, when I read your book, that kind of brought it into focus. This, how real the matrix really interfered with getting innovations up into the market.
You needed many people to agree to something to get it to happen, but only one person needs to say no, and everything would stop.
Exactly. Yeah. The first here, and then.
Another one as well. Another comment which we get a lot from the Angel ex-Nokia. There are a lot of guys who were very active in the 90s, and then in the middle of the 2010 something. So they have a lot of people like new guys were coming in, and they were they're stuck in the system, and they were working like their ass off. Then suddenly there was a corporation. So I haven't read the book yet, but the old model, which I remember from younger days, that the matrix of Nokia was very, very famous.
Yes,
and
famously
so
agile.
Was it the second one that after the renewal, was that the main reason that they weren't able to succeed in building matrix in a more effective way? Because that's the main reason why so many left, like after 2005, they felt that there were too many people saying no than yes.
Yeah, I think so. The matrix organization is very good for some things. Just like marketing, if they had a new product come out, the marketing could work on that, and then switch to the next product coming out. And it was very good for redistributing some resources like that. But when it came to decision making, I mean, it was awful. Especially if they had people scattered all over the world, and they needed teams in Germany and America and Finland all to be able to work together, and even scheduling something like a conference call was a huge endeavor to get done. So all this energy was being expended in this internal keeping the structure alive. So it wasn't just the matrix system, but it was also, I guess, the way
they implemented it.
The way they wanted to have decisions made or have projects go forward. This process was so unwieldy.
It was unbelievably frustrating from a startup's perspective. I mean, absolutely, I don't know how many meetings we came out with thinking, hey, we've got a deal now. And then just nothing happens. And then it turns out, that somebody else, it was not this guy's. This guy had like 1/7 of the decision, and he had to then, go out and get these other people to agree. And it seemed that the culture there was not, there weren't champions. There weren't champions that would really, somehow they weren't rewarded for figuring out the matrix themselves. They'd throw their hands up and say, well, let's have another meeting about it. And,
one example I use from my experience in journalism was if I wanted to get a quote about some new product or some new service, I would contact their public relations department. Well, then they would need to get this person's approval to say something, and that person. Then, of course, then the quotes would have to go back through and be approved. And I would never get anything done. It was impossible to get anything out of the public relations department. But if I had a single name and contact one person, then I could get information. So the people were able to do their jobs, but the organization was stopping them.
And have you compared that with Samsung or Apple? How does the model work?
Yeah, it's funny. I hate to say it, but they can do it, but Nokia couldn't. I mean, if you contact Apple, you'll get answers. If you contact Samsung or Huawei, you'll get answers through the regular channels. But it didn't work with Nokia.
Okay.
Yeah, Henry.
So, yeah, maybe with a comment or question. I remember it was like 2000 when I used to work for Nokia as a master thesis worker, and I remember even some of the internal meetings where Jorma Ollila was saying that let's not become arrogant. So that was like the number one. They only like 15 years ago they were well, obviously I think something went wrong. But also I think I remember like the early days when the Salo operation took on the fly. I guess the spirit was something that you will never get any permission, but you will always be forgiven if something goes wrong. So I think that was the spirit and attitude. So what do you think?
Yeah,
They
yeah.
lost it or somehow.
I think that's exactly right. You heard a lot of stories about how they gave great responsibility, but they gave great freedom. So you were accountable for your own actions, but you had a great deal of freedom to do what you thought necessary. There's a great example of the head of procurement. He had a joke that he could go into his office and say, oh, I'm going to Tokyo today. And no one would question him. Okay. They thought he would be doing the right thing. He knew what he was doing. And back in those days, they did have great freedom and great responsibility. But that changed as they got bigger and the organization got more bloated. All of a sudden, it'd be impossible to just walk into the office and say you're going to Tokyo. You'd have to go through all the different departments and your supervisors and all this stuff. So it couldn't happen anymore.
But it's like when you hear from Aalto, I guess this is happening in Aalto also. Because we got like a couple of million funding for the Kone Corporation. We had a meeting in Kone, and my travel claim was returned because I didn't have agenda. We are meeting with the R&D department of Kone in research project, and Aalto controllers don't approve if there is no agenda. So I'll see this thing happening.
Wow. That's the first time that's ever happened.
Happening in Aalto also. So
It does.
Be warned.
Well,
Yeah.
all big organizations have to worry about that.
Yeah.
But I think just
Getting the balance right is tough, but it's fundamental.
I think Nokia was worse at that than most other large organizations.
And of course, such massively successful. I mean, at the backdrop of, the record, some of the most profitable quarters of all times they're announcing. At the same time as the iPhone's coming out and people are kind of wondering. So that's where I think people a little bit lose 2007 and 2008 financially, Nokia was kicking ass basically.
No, yeah, I mean, Nokia reached 40% market share after the iPhone was in the market. So yeah, they were still on their upward trajectory even after the disruption started.
Absolutely. Yeah. Peter.
Sorry. Could you say something about the role or impact, positive or negative, by Stephen Ellop as the last CEO of Nokia?
He gets such bad press, but some of the things he did, he hasn't got any credit for. Like, he really tried to cut down on the bureaucracy, on even little things. Like he tried to change the bureaucratic mindset. It used to be called the Group Executive Board. This is all the top executives, and he changed it to leadership team, and just trying to get people's ideas that your job isn't to sit into a boardroom. Your job is to lead, and that's just one example of the things he tried to do. So he did some really good things with the organization, but all of that's been overshadowed because of the Windows mistake. So he got such bad press, and I understand why he did, because it was a disaster. But some of the things he tried to change in the company, it needed to be done.
Yeah. Hey Keith, OP, and then Paolo.
Still one question concerning Symbian. How do you see the difference, or what was the impact of, say, Symbian being not so good in as a platform for third-party developers and ecosystem, and say to bring up new apps on top of it?
Yeah,
compared to, say, the alternatives, and at what point of time Nokia really realized this?
That's a good point. I think that was very important because they, even like when MeeGo was coming out, and MeeGo was a great system, but they took it to the operators they took prototypes of the N9, and the operators were saying, well, this is great, but where's the ecosystem? And that's what killed it. If they had people interested, then they would have had something. But Symbian was the same way. All the attention of the third-party developers was on, iOS or Android. And Samsung had the same problem when they tried to come up with their own operating system. They didn't have the interest that they needed.
They didn't catalyze the ecosystem early enough to.
There was a lot of lip service.
Yeah.
Also inside Nokia for this.
But
they really didn't have
exactly. I mean, you saw, was it Nokia Club or Club Nokia? It was everywhere. But as a developer, it was you get a few beers and some access to some code, but not much more.
The APIs, the support, the technical support, the tools, they were lousy compared to. And then they didn't have the business model.
Yes.
That Apple came up.
Yeah, exactly. I think at one point they were only giving 30% of revenues to the developers, and all of a sudden Apple came and said,
70%.
Yeah, and so Nokia looked very bad at compared to the competition.
Well, they had the message that we have all these millions, hundreds of millions of users, and then with this little upstart system doesn't have anything.
Well, I still would like to get back to the basics or so-called big picture about this handicap in software, because it has been said that 70, 80 or even 90% of value added in these devices are based on software. So I remember in 2008, TechCrunch journalist wrote that Symbian and Nokia are irrelevant companies from that time on because they cannot respond to iPhone's great user interface and software. And it's not only the operating system apps in this mobile space, but all the infrastructure software. Anyone who has tried to use PC suite or Office suite or whatever it was called, maybe understands that. So why on earth the leading company in the world, having all the resources, having all those capabilities and companies and resources even in Finland, couldn't make a change in that? So what was the main obstacle?
Yeah, Ovi was a disaster. They tried to do everything. It wasn't just an app store, even though some people still think of it as an app store, but it had so many other services involved. And they tried to do so much in one big push that would handle all these different product lines, that had all these different versions of operating systems. A lot of the software engineers, they don't talk about Symbian, they talk about Symbians, as if there were many different versions of it. And trying to have all of this work together, when Apple, they had one product, one operating system, and one iStore.
And one Steve Jobs.
And one Steve Jobs. So I think that was a major point. And of course, some of the people in Ovi, I don't think were the right ones. Like Orienpera, very smart guy, but why'd they put him in front of entertainment?
Yeah.
And I don't think that was his calling. They put the wrong people in the wrong places.
Well, it probably has some interesting.
Yeah, actually, all what I learning at campus actually at Nokia for 13 years, especially in Kirby's there for marketing in Asia for a few years. Which one do you think was the biggest inflection point from Nokia changing trajectory? Was it OPK appointment?
Well, even after OPK was appointed, he gets a lot of the blame. But remember, the best years of Nokia were under OPK. They weren't under Olila. But OPK, I think that was the biggest downfall for them. Even before OPK, though, some of the structural problems that were put in place under Olila. But at the time, they made sense and they worked very well, like the segmenting the market in that situation. But OPK, he was too conservative. He didn't have the vision, and I think the biggest problem was he wasn't inspirational. He saw what was happening, but he couldn't get anything done.
What's your feeling?
I agree. I think there was a lack of leadership, and then seeing from the inside, we saw things coming, but there was no bold decisions to drive that, nobody to make bold decisions to go in those directions, and there were all the elements, but even on these practical things, the execution was lousy.
Mm.
And yeah, I mean, like, one inner joke was kind of like, headless chicken run. Running around making slides, but no action.
Yeah.
Yeah, Henry.
This is a quick question. Who's the CEO of Samsung? I mean, I don't know, but like, suppose Nokia doing something,
Yeah.
Samsung doing Apple, now we are saying OPK, Steve Jobs.
Yeah.
Who's the guy behind Samsung? So is it like a one-man show, or is it the organization? This is something I'm always puzzling because they are saying that
The
Nokia
inspiration
doing
supporting
something,
him.
or Supercell doing something, or
It's a great point.
Japan and Supercell. There might be like one person or Steve Jobs doing something, but what's your take on how much role there is like one
That one individual can do it.
versus like the dream team versus the whole organization and entrepreneurial inside the organization?
I think the overall culture and the attitude is very important. Warren Buffett, the famous investor, he says he always looks for a company that runs so good that even an idiot could run it. Because sooner or later, an idiot will run it. The CEO is important, but maybe the organizational culture is more important.
No, that's really an interesting. That's and I guess who runs Huawei and some others. So it's a good point. Any other? I'd like to maybe ask you what your view of the future is. What do you think is it a shot that we're going to see the second coming of Nokia? Or no? Was it the third or fourth? I don't know.
Or more than that, yes. Oh, I'm actually very, very optimistic about the new Nokia. They're very strong in networks. They've got some great people there. Suri, he's got a lot of talent, a lot of competencies behind him, and location-based business, advanced technologies. All of that, I think, is very well put together, and they can get their capital structure back into shape. And I think we'll see some good things come out of Nokia in the future.
Great.
What about the phones?
I'm not optimistic about the phones. I think when Microsoft bought the devices and services, they had a goal of 15% market share by 2018 or something like that, I think. And if they were to get that, that would be wonderful. But I think they need to survive until the next big disruption happens in the market. It seems, based upon history, there's a big disruption as soon as the next generation of mobile technology is fairly well accepted. It's not majority used, but fairly well. 4G is just getting to that point now. So I think within the next couple of years, that's when we're going to see a big change. Maybe wearable technologies, I don't know. But there'll be a big disruption happening, I think, within 2 or 3 years. And if Microsoft can survive long enough until then
The phone unit.
yes, the phone unit, right.
The idiot question or the suggestion of Warren Buffett. What was the idiot part of Nokia? Was it the organization? Was it a certain succession of individuals?
What was the what?
The idiot part.
The
It was both, I think. I mean, the organization and the leader. But both were bad.
They interacted in a really dysfunctional way, I think, in some sense. So again, people in the wrong people in the wrong roles.